Welcome to the Utah Stories program. Today on the program, we have Glenn Bailey, the Executive Director of Urban Crossroads Center, or Crossroads Urban Center. It's one of the best homeless organizations in terms of helping the homeless who need assistance right away, emergency food. They help people who have questions, problems. They help them come up with solutions. I think it's a great model. They've also been instrumental in starting Wasatch Community Gardens, which is an awesome program to have lower income people be able to have garden space and grow their own food. And so we'll be talking to him with him in a minute. But I wanted to talk about why it is we're doing what we're doing here on the Utah Stories program, focusing so much on homelessness and housing. So it was about a year ago, I did a stroll from Sugar House Park to Fairmont Park. It's a common pathway I go down. And I noticed more people camping out, homeless people in the park. And I stopped and talked to one of them. I already played that interview a couple of weeks ago. It was all about how this couple just couldn't afford housing any longer. They also had a drug addiction problem. And they were shocked by how the moral depravity of Salt Lake City had kind of broken down. There was so much more drug trafficking, sex trafficking going on than they had ever seen before. And they just said that it's kind of shocking to see this in Salt Lake City because we've always kind of been known for our cleanliness, I suppose, and that everyone was sort of taken care of, and everybody sort of takes care of everybody. We had this sort of small town feel to Salt Lake City, and they said they weren't getting a sense of that anymore. And then I started looking at the Gerald E. King Women's Shelter, and I noticed there's a lot of mentally ill ladies out in front yelling profanities. They obviously weren't getting taken care of how they needed to be taken care of. And then a lot of people just wandering the streets, open air drug scenes, and it's a growing problem. And the inclination, I think, if you're a resident, is just to say, why don't these people just go get jobs? But what's clear that's happened, and we had Samuel Grenny on the program a couple weeks ago addressing this, is the bottom rung of the socioeconomic ladder has essentially collapsed. There's a lot of people who have been priced out of housing, who are recently homeless, who used to be able to afford easily a $900 a month. Now their rent's gone up to $1,500, $1,600 a month, and they just simply can't afford housing anymore. And so a lot of these recently homeless people are trying to figure out what do they need to do to get off the streets. And that's really what I want to talk about with Glenn today. Glenn, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Sure.
So what is your recommendation? I came across a lady, I would say about 2 months ago. She was one of these people paying $800-900 a month, and her landlord doubled her rent. She has bad credit. She couldn't get into a new apartment, and now she's sleeping out of a tent. How do you handle these people, or what do you tell them they should go and do?
Well, first of all, I would say this is a national problem. It's not. Sometimes I think people see so many folks on the street in Salt Lake, and it's true. I see more than I've ever seen before of people trying to live on the street. But the thing is, that's happening in every city in our country. So one thing that's important to know is that this isn't just Salt Lake City. This is a problem that is nationwide, and so is gentrification. You mentioned the raising rents. Rents are out of control. You're right. And it's true in every major American city. So this is a nationwide problem. Now, in terms of what you can do in Salt Lake, your options, or in Utah generally, your options are pretty limited. We don't have any way to control rising rents. The legislature has made that illegal. So cities have a limited number of tools that they can use to control rents. And we're not developing anywhere near enough affordable housing, yet alone low-income housing. So one of the things that's happening is people, for instance, who are trying to survive on SSI can't afford housing with what they're able to earn on SSI, and you're seeing more mentally ill people or people with disabilities generally, kind of turn loose on the street or put into really impossible positions. So in terms of housing opportunities, it takes years to get a housing voucher. And then sometimes people can't find a place they can even use those vouchers and end up turning them back. The best thing that I've seen is project-based Section 8, where there's a building where you don't pay more than 30% of your income for rent and utilities. But it's not a voucher that's portable with the client. The subsidy belongs to the building. So it's like a deal.
Palmer Court or Grace Mary Manor?
No, those are even another model. These would be apartments that are owned by a private landlord who has an agreement with the federal government. And those are project-based Section 8s. So they function like a Section 8 voucher, only the whole building has that sort of subsidy directly between the government and the landlord.
Can you point out an example? I'm not sure.
Well, there are a lot more of those buildings that are focused on people with disabilities or seniors than there are families.
Okay.
But an example might be Escalante Park, which is at 10th North and Redwood Road, right next to that disc golf course. It used to be the par 3 golf course.
Mm-hmm.
That is project-based Section 8.
Okay.
And it's a nice place to live, and it's mostly seniors, some people with disabilities. Capitol Villa in the Marmalade neighborhood's another example. There's quite a few. Now, in terms of family project-based Section 8s, there's not very many at all. Mm-hmm. Mostly those are for seniors or people with disabilities. And they can be hard to get into, but there can be surprising vacancies there sometimes too, where you can get in a lot easier than you think, but you kind of have to know where they are, where to look. And you mentioned, of course, the other big barrier that people have in a market like this, where it's a landlord's market, is bad credit.
Yeah.
Or particularly homeless folks. They're usually homeless because they've been evicted somewhere. That is really hard to overcome in a tight housing market where landlords have their choice of tenants.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think we were having this program where we were showing this couple who they had specific ideas for how housing should work. The guy who I interviewed, this homeless guy, he's like, well, if you're strung out, you should just not be able to live anywhere except the total ghetto because you're on drugs, you're a nuisance, but then if you get clean, you should be able to at least live in like a tiny home. And then if you get cleaner, you should be able to be given like a voucher, so that there's some kind of built-in incentive for people to get off drugs and to move, a little bit higher in life. But the problem that I see out there is that not only are seniors getting priced out of the market, which just go down to town in Salt Lake City, you just see old people on the side of on the road and I interviewed a gentleman who was living on a tent, 65-year-old guy. I just can't afford with my SSI check to get into an apartment. It's just, I think the difficulty is there are so many different types of homeless people. You almost can't, that term is almost counterproductive because you cannot clump mentally ill people in with drug addicts, in with seniors, in with people who are just recently priced out of the market. They're just so totally different. And it's not like you can find a one-size-fits-all solution. So, affordability in terms of housing is definitely important, but how do you help people in the shorter term get off drugs when they're living on the streets? Is there any solution to that problem?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. There are as many different problems or reasons why people become homeless as there are people who experience homelessness. I think it's really dangerous when you start to generalize, because there are people, like you say, who are homeless because they've had a run of bad luck. There's people who are homeless because they become addicted to drugs or alcohol. There's people who are homeless and they're addicted to drugs and alcohol because they're homeless. It's very difficult to live on the street, very stressful. So it's almost like chicken or an egg. Do you become homeless because you have problems, or do you become homeless and then develop those problems? So in terms of drugs, that's very difficult. 20 years ago, the majority of the people we would see at our food pantry downtown who had substance abuse issues were alcoholics. Very often people who would be on the street drinking mouthwash, things like that. Those were the folks that, we would see every day. In the early part of the century, they started developing housing first buildings, like Grace Mary Manor, for example. And some of those people disappeared. And we thought they're dead because that's usually what happens. But some of them actually got into permanently supportive housing. And when we saw them again, they were unrecognizable. It doesn't mean that all their problems went away. Doesn't mean, they never drank again. But they had a place where they could be safe and live off the street. And it makes such a tremendous difference. It makes all kinds of other things possible. So, to say you have to kind of work your way up to deserve housing seems to me completely backward. I think we need to find ways to bring people in to whatever housing situation they're able to handle, and then work with them to address the issues that have caused homelessness in the first place. And that seems to me to be a much more effective strategy, just based on my experience in seeing people who have been homeless and then seeing them after they've gotten into housing. But right now, you're right. I mean, I think, 20 years ago were people with substance abuse almost always were alcohol problems. Now people that we see with substance abuse are almost always drug problems.
Huh. Wow. And that's in the past 20 years.
I would say, yeah, not exactly, but sure. Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah, and so we reported on, and we took a lot of flack for it. We had an inside source verified by another inside source that the new Magnolia apartments, which are permanent supportive housing, there was drug trafficking going on there. There was human trafficking going on there, prostitution, and that there wasn't, and I'm not blaming the organization who's running that, but the problem was there wasn't enough support for the tenants who were living there to get off drugs, and there wasn't enough incentive built in to get off. And so the project has turned into quite a problem for both the tenants living there and their safety, as well as the surrounding neighborhood. Do you have any ideas about how you can maintain the housing first, no strings attached policy and get people to improve their lives who live in this permanent supportive housing model?
Yeah, I think part of it is, and I know people don't like to hear this, but it's resources. So you can build permanently supportive housing, but in order to provide the support, you have to have resources that you can work with people. You have to have people to work with people, and you have to have resources that can really help folks. So that's part of it, and I think that's being discussed to some degree at the state level, about having a dedicated revenue stream that simply goes to support.
Yeah, because
just building housing, although that's still the most critical thing we can do, is build housing people can actually afford to live in. Absolutely number one priority. But if you're going to have permanently supportive housing, you have to be able to provide that support, and that costs money. And I think a lot of homeless service providers, despite what you've heard from groups like the Pioneer Park Coalition and the Legislative Auditor's Office, who love to exaggerate how much money is being spent on X, Y, and Z, and who has access to those funds, it's a question of having adequate resources to do those jobs. That doesn't mean that every single person who's got a drug problem is going to kick it. Of course not. And that's independent of homelessness. But there are also some great programs like First Step House that work with people and have residential programs that actually work and help people who are ready to change their lives. So we need more of that too.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a difficult challenge because on the one hand you have the state legislature and the Pioneer Park Coalition type people who really want to just push more accountability for the dollars spent. And they think that, well, okay, if we're going to give the figure I've heard them use is $200 million to homelessness and affordable housing, we want to be able to track those outcomes. Do you think that outcome tracking is not relevant, that shouldn't be tracked?
I think it's relevant. I think it's already being done. I think it's really easy to talk about data. We're talking about human lives, and there is data about who comes into the system, how long they stay in the system, outcomes, all kinds of data. I really think that that's important, but it's also been a red herring. We want to talk about tracking people's outcomes, and there's a whole system that does that. already. Layers of
So
system.
you can track all these
Sure,
people who are
you could go
some of these-
online right now, and you could go to the state's, to the website for a homeless management information system, and you can get dashboard data right now. Now, whether you can get the data the Pioneer Park Coalition wants, I don't know. But the other thing that's true about groups like the Pioneer Park Coalition, and yes, like the legislature, is that to some degree there's a built-in bias against programs like those that are run by the Road Home, which are not perfect. I don't run a perfect program either. I don't work with perfect people. I'm not sure I know anybody who does. But I do know that the Pioneer Park Coalition didn't start because of their love for homeless people. They started because they were funded by developers who wanted to develop in the Pioneer Park area. And that was the goal. And they developed this affection for homeless people along the way, I think, because it was a political move that allowed them to accomplish what they wanted. The Road Home's not there anymore. That was their number one priority. And so I am a little more suspicious of the motivations of groups like that. Not that they can't do good work or have good ideas. Absolutely they can, and it takes everyone. But I think their motivation, their original purpose, had nothing to do really with improving the lives of homeless people. And in terms of the legislature, it's similar. I think there's a lot of folks in the legislature that are predisposed to not want to help folks.
Yeah.
They are predisposed to a view that people should be helping themselves, sort of a limited government kind of philosophy. Obviously, we know that. And, so they're going to be predisposed to cast at least a skeptical eye on programs that require money.
Yeah, well, the thing that I don't understand when I look at the mandates kind of passed down from the state legislature and, what's going on now is how can you mandate no public camping laws when the resource center is full and when people are, as we know, are getting more and more priced out of the market and are just looking for a place to stay safe for as long as they need to. How can you mandate that with a clear conscience? Because this bulldozing the homeless constantly, these abatement programs are so horribly traumatic on people. They might find a safe place, a field, and have some people around them who are protecting them. They feel like they got each other's backs, and then all of a sudden, a front end loader comes in and you got to go, and it's just extremely sad, and I've witnessed that happening, it just seems to me if we had 2,000 people who were refugees land in Utah, we would take so much better care of them than we're taking care of these people who are just in really unfortunate housing circumstances.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the direct example would be Hurricane Katrina, when we had all those folks come to town because so many people were being moved out of the New Orleans area. And they were, although some of those folks did become homeless and lived in our front yard. So it's not exclusively true. But there was a really solid effort to try and help people at the front end of that crisis. And that kind of effort, you don't usually see with our homegrown homeless people, people here that are experiencing homelessness who aren't coming from anywhere else. And the camps are really really problematic for a lot of reasons. And I'm not just talking about for people who don't want to see camps, or for city officials, or for legislative officials, but for the people that actually have to live there. The conditions in the camps are not good. I've never seen a camp, and there are some where people have, like you say, made a really solid effort to provide services and support to folks who are living in those camps, and those are better. But for most part, it's not a place anyone wants to live. It's not safe.
Well, in the short term, do you think we need to have a city or state-sanctioned camp just so these people have a place to go?
That is a really interesting question. I think that there's pluses and minuses to that strategy. One thing is, if you had a sanctioned campground, does it take away from the pressure that we all should feel to provide decent housing that people can live in instead of camps. Now we have a camp, so I guess we're good. Or if we set up 3 new homeless shelters, even though they don't have the capacity the old homeless shelter did, I guess we're good. No, we need housing. We need housing opportunities, and we need supports that are going to help people take advantage of those housing opportunities and stay housed. That's what we need. Now, given the situation that we have all these folks on the street, do we need sanctioned camps? Maybe it'll come to that. I think that part of the thing that you'll face, though, is who's going to live there. Right now, the people in camps that sprout up are following, their own rules, in a sense.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to pay attention to the police, and the police are a big hassle, and all of that's true. But, if you had a sanctioned camp, for instance, the Other Side Academy is starting that tiny home village. Mm-hmm. And I think that's great, and that's going to work for some people. It's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah.
Because they're going to say no drugs, standards, no alcohol. They're going to have rules that some people just aren't going to want to follow. And those people, that model's not going to work for them.
Yeah.
And I think it would be the same if you had a sanctioned camp, depending on what the rules were and how they were enforced and who was doing the enforcement.
But should we be allowing people to camp outside openly using drugs and alcohol? I mean, that's not allowed in places like, I often go back to the example of the Dutch. They've really done a good job having public spaces be free of drugs and alcohol by not calling them homeless encampments if drugs and alcohol are being used, but calling them open air drug scenes. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's where I take issue, because if you're walking around a park with your little kids and you're seeing needles and you're seeing people using drugs, and I was seeing that a lot in Fairmount Park, shouldn't those people just be taken to jail?
Well, now you're talking about clearing the camps, because if you go to any homeless campment, you're going to find needles too. So should we just be clearing them all? And where do we put them? Does that mean we incarcerate everybody who has to camp? So I guess it's illegal to be homeless.
Well, no,
then.
I wouldn't make it illegal to be homeless, but illegal to just be using drugs all day. I mean, I know people need drugs and alcohol as a relief to homelessness. I can understand that. But in broad daylight, in the middle of the day, I in a public park, it just seems like that's not the best thing a person should be doing.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. The question is, what do you do? What is the solution to that?
Yeah.
And is it to pack the jails full of folks like that, who then stay there, and then when they get out, we give them nothing. They just get right back out onto the street, and this is familiar. And why do we expect they're going to change?
Yeah.
Why? What possible reason would there be when we've done nothing and their lives have not changed at all?
Well, we had David Droscher on the program, who's the executive director of the Other Side Academy. Mm-hmm. He's a former drug and alcohol user, was convicted and in jail so many times in prison. Yeah. And he said, prison is actually what made him finally change, because he, like you said, right when he'd get out, he'd be making his next fix, working on the next deal. And he had no incentive at all to get out until finally they were going to slam him with a 20-year penalty. And then that Delancey Street was made available, mm-hmm. and he just decided to do that because he said, my option was either get in there or serve a 20-year to life sentence.
Yeah, and those programs work great for some people. The Other Side Academy has had really good success with folks that have gotten into their programs. First Step House has too. There's different things that work for different people. Yeah. The rescue mission works for some people. Turn their lives over to Jesus, and that works for some people. It doesn't work for other people at all. So I think that one of the things we need to be about is trying to come up with as many different strategies to provide assistance to people as we possibly can, because different things are going to work for different people. Different kinds of housing opportunities are going to work for different people too.
So do you think primarily the answer is just more resources for more of this population? Or what?
Primarily, yes, not exclusively, but sure, primarily, yeah, I do. I think that despite the numbers that you hear thrown around, which, it's real easy to do creative math. I don't think there's enough resources that are focused in the right areas to really help people and to sustain programs that could help people. Think about when we opened the 3 new resource centers. Frankly, they're just shelters. They're not resource centers. And they never had a chance to be the resource centers that were designed and envisioned because they aren't funded well enough. In fact, the first provider of the one in the ballpark quit after a year because they couldn't do that job. Those jobs are very difficult. And you're seeing hundreds of people packed into a facility. You're trying to move them along so that you can bring in the next folks. Last time I was at the Midvale Family Shelter, it was full. It was over capacity. And they'd given away all their motel vouchers. So if you have a family and you end up at the Midvale Family Shelter, and maybe that's not true tonight, but it was a month ago, they're going to say, we can't help you. Just can't help you. That's a function of resources.
Yeah.
That's not just a function of, the nonprofits are wasting money. I don't think by and large that's true. I think people are trying to do the best they can with an overwhelming problem and not enough money, resources, to meet the needs. And that's not exclusively true, of course. There's always problems with different things, and I think you probably heard all those stories.
Yeah.
But primarily, as you say, the problem is resources.
Well, do you think it was a huge mistake to tear down the road home?
I think it was a huge mistake to tear down the road home until you had adequate capacity to do the same job.
Yeah.
I do. I absolutely do. I think it was political.
I absolutely agree with you.
And it was always about capacity. And I told Mayor McAdams that. And, at one time he said, I don't think we should tear down the road home until it's at the demand for it is at functional zero. And then he changed his mind. And
that was his call.
Well, he was heavily involved in that. Yes. He was leading the process that led to the creation of the
Because I
resource
talked to
centers.
people in Grace Mary Manor, they'd rather be in the downtown road home shelter. They felt like they had that was like a safeguard. It was like a safe haven, right where all the resources are. And it was functional. It was I mean, the problem was I think there was a MRSA outbreak. Before they tore it down, I was talking to all these people saying MRSA's going around, but they could have cleaned that up.
Sure.
They could have just gotten everybody out for a few weeks and cleaned it up.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, the reason why the road home shelter was where it was is that neighborhood around Pioneer Park neighborhood, at the time those services were developed, was kind of a place where Salt Lake City, at least unofficially, they wouldn't admit it, kind of put everything they didn't want to deal with. Mm-hmm. So all the taxi cab stands, all the railroad yards, all the gay bars, the Mexican Civic Center, and, let's put in the homeless shelters. But people who cared about homeless folks took advantage of that to develop things like the 4th Street Clinic, like St. Vincent de Paul, like the Road Home Shelter, and like you mentioned, it co-located services so people didn't have to spend all day going around town trying to, keep body and soul together. So that was a co-located model. And when they did the scattered site shelter model, what you needed to do then was create 3 of those neighborhoods to provide those same services in those different areas. And they had a great plan to do it, but it's a very expensive model. If we're willing to invest in that, that's great.
But
let's build more shelters. Let's get more staff. Let's have health care. Let's have food on site. They built kitchens that they couldn't equip in those new shelters. And that's not the fault of the providers. We needed to close the road home for whatever reason, which is now a construction site if you go down there.
Yeah.
But we spent a lot of time trying to justify why the new model was going to be better, and it was never going to be better. And that was the tragedy of that situation. We should have built a better model. And then when the road home wasn't required anymore, close it, sure. But we never let that happen because there was too much urgency to get rid of that facility in that neighborhood.
Yeah, I'll have to take what you said up with the Pioneer Park Coalition because I've never heard that before.
Oh, they'll
I'll
have
have
a whole
to.
different story there. But I was around when they first started and was involved in discussions with them right from the very beginning.
Hmm.
And no, I think that the reason they formed was to make that neighborhood safe for development.
Wow.
And that was their goal. And along the way, they realized, gee, there's all these homeless people. We're going to have to come up with something to do. And politically, we can't just say they're all trash. So I guess they're our friends. And we'll be about trying to come up with, ways to help them. But if that's not really your goal, that's not really going to be your outcome.
Yeah.
And they'll disagree with me vociferously about that. That's fine. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah. Well, it's a very difficult situation because, like you said, it's not only Salt Lake City, it's Denver, it's San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, Los Angeles. It's like we're all facing this because rents are going up. We're now facing inflation. There's all this pressure, and there's no easy solution. But I mean, it just seems like one of the major issues is our urban centers are getting way more expensive in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And in the meantime, our rural areas have been getting depopulated. There's far fewer jobs in rural areas, and a lot of people in rural areas, they tell me how much they want to be, they have to work in the city to be able to afford the rural lifestyle. And, this is a big, 10,000 view look at it, but is there any way to make it so more people can live and work in rural areas and enjoy life where there's fewer people and less housing pressure?
Boy, that's a good question, and I certainly hope there would be. It's not my area of expertise, so I could sit here and talk about what I don't know for the next 5 minutes. But yeah, you're right. I think that it's very, very difficult for people to make it in rural areas. And so when people have families and their kids grow up, there isn't anything there for them, even if they want to stay in that community. And that's a huge problem. You're right.
Yeah, we've got a story in our last issue. It's about it's a place way in the middle of sort of southwestern Utah, kind of near Dugway. It's about 250 acres that are parsed out into 2.5 acre areas where this group teaches people how to be self-sufficient, live off grid, grow their own food, live in a small house, but just more communal co-op living where you're away from the housing costs and the food costs and the fuel costs that's pricing so many people out of the market. And it just seems like that could be a way to go. I mean, if people were willing to learn those skills and do that work.
Yeah. More of a subsistence model. Really.
Yeah, like kind of what the pioneers had in mind when they came here in the first place. But is that would anything like that be realistic for the homeless population, retraining them to learn to do these subsistence skills or activities so that they could, go and just be functional somewhere?
I'd say, like I said before, it's going to work for some people. It's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah.
I think the vast majority of people need to have something they can do to earn an income.
Yeah.
Whether that's a job or if they're disabled, adequate subsidy so that they can keep body and soul together. So certainly that could help some people, and there's some people who probably embrace that opportunity. But there's other folks that really live in Salt Lake City. Maybe they've always lived in Salt Lake City or in Salt Lake County. This is their home, and they just can't afford it. And that's an unjust situation that we all as a society should be addressing. Not necessarily by making folks reinvent themselves. I think giving people the opportunity to is great, but I think people have the right to be able to live and breathe in their home communities without having to worry about camping on the street. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think we all have to accept this is everybody's problem. It's not just downtown Salt Lake City's problem or Salt Lake County's. It's all of Utah's problem, and we need to address it, and we need to build the affordable housing. And we had Carol Hollowell from Switchpoint on, and it's like if every county decided right now we're going to build 1,000 housing units per county, problem solved. There's enough affordable housing for everybody. It's just like the political will to do that is different from, yourself and people like Carol calling for it to happen.
And in rural areas, they have a lot of, the pressure can be intense. I mean, look at what just happened in Moab. Moab has no place for the people that actually make the city function, the community function, to live.
Yeah, we've reported on that.
They've even just passed a law now, and we'll see what the legal challenges come out to, where they say, if you're going to develop a multifamily building in Moab, 30%, I think they ended up with a third of the people that of the units have to be available to the people that work in our city. And they're probably going to get sued for it. But that kind of thing, and Park City has a similar program that they've had for decades that is on inclusionary housing, where if you develop multi-unit housing, some of it has to be affordable to people who are working in the support sector, right?
Well, I know they forced
that. And so that's important.
Yeah, they forced that on Vail and Aspen. If you were building a hotel, you had to provide housing for the workers at that hotel.
Right.
And I've heard they were going to start doing that, imposing that in Moab as well. And
I think they'll try. Yeah, I think they'll try. A lot of what we face when communities, local governments come up with those kind of creative solutions is, kind of the beat down from the legislature. Because a lot of those folks are developers, or, they get campaign contributions from developers. That's their constituency. So if they feel that that's preventing them from doing what they need to do, they're going to lobby against those things. Yeah. But clearly people in rural areas who are working hard should be able to afford to have a place to put their head at night. I don't see it. I can't see it any other way. And I think one of the things that we've come to realize, we have a annual poverty summit, which brings together people from the faith community, low-income people, homeless people, people who just care about folks that live in poverty. And we had that at the end of August, and one of the people we had there was Wayne Niederauer, who's the state homeless coordinator. And he said something very interesting, because if you remember, Wayne was the president of the Senate, I think.
Developer politician.
And so we, worked trying to influence him for years and years for resources for low-income people. But as he's been doing this job, I think he's realized some things. And one of the things he said that surprised a lot of people was the private sector can't do this. You can't count on the private sector to solve homelessness or to provide deeply affordable housing because there's no money in it.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, then we all have a responsibility as a community, as a state, city, county, to step up, because government exists to do what the market can't or won't. And I think deeply affordable housing is one of those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I would take a bit of an issue on that, because I live in Murray, and around my house there's all these lots that are half acre and one house, and they're not big houses. And I think that we was just talking to Nick Norris about zoning. If you allowed somebody to zone a little tiny home development behind their house in a half acre, and then they could rent out these units for $400 or $500 a month, if the zoning allowed that, I would imagine some people would jump on that. I mean, because that could pay for their retirement. It could pay for, their own means to become a landlord and not have to have a massive amount of units in a different place and an easy upkeep. Do you look at zoning as being a problem in the United States, especially, and the way these NIMBYs want to prevent all changes to zoning to allow for affordable housing and tiny home developments?
I look at zoning differently than, say, Mr. Norris. Yes, it can be a problem, and there's been a lot of work to try and loosen up regulations around accessory dwelling units so that you could put an ADU on your property, have an income stream, and stay in your own home and help somebody else. That makes perfect sense. And yes, NIMBY is a big problem. Nobody wants a homeless shelter in their backyard. Nobody wants anything that looks like affordable housing in their backyard. Yeah, those are problems, absolutely. But I don't think zoning, just doing away with zoning is the solution to that, because I think that just all bets are off then. And people who are developing property, their goal is to maximize profits, not make your neighborhood a better place to live. I think communities have rights, and there has to be a balance between this sort of, I'm going to shut the door now that I've got mine, and anything goes. What I don't agree with the planners about is that any density is good density, and that density creates affordable housing. I think that's completely wrong-headed. It doesn't. Density creates density, and developers, people in the real estate business, are maximizing profits. That's what they do. I don't blame them for that. That's our system. But that doesn't create very low-income affordable housing. That's the problem.
No, not usually.
Not usually. Not usually. I mean, there are enlightened developers who make a point of doing that, looking for subsidies and trying to include affordability in their developments, but they're few and far between.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there's just a lot of possibilities for answers, and we just need to change. We need to change our mindset about what we're accepting, and realize this is everybody's problem.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and it's a lot of people need to get outside their comfort zone. And when we see people camping on the street, it takes us outside our comfort zone. We just need to go to a useful place with that, not a defensive place.
Yeah. Well, that feels like a good place to wrap up. Thanks for coming on the program, Glenn.
Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I like what you're doing. So you can check out the Crossroads Urban Center at, do you have a website?
We do, crossroadsurbancenter.org.
All right. Okay, and if you would like to support this program, you can subscribe to Utah Stories Magazine. This is our latest burger issue. It's the best burgers you can find. It's a lot softer content in the magazine. It's kind of where to go, what to see. We do have some really awesome stories this month about Utah beer breweries winning gold in a national contest, and stories about farming in Castle Valley in Moab, what we were talking about. But you can subscribe to the magazine for $2 a month, $24 for the entire year, and that helps us get the message out of the voice of local Utah. So thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.